I'm Mark Seifter.
And I'm Linda Zayas Palmer.
And this is Arcane Mark.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome
to Arcane Mark. Today we're going to be talking about how to write published adventures.
As opposed to when you write adventures just for your home group and you're just going to run them there just with your friends or your enemies or whoever you usually have in your home group.
So if you're writing a published adventure, you may be creating it entirely from scratch by yourself, or you may be accepting a contract from someone else to write an adventure. If you are accepting a contract, be sure to follow all instructions in the contract.
Even if it contradicts what we say here.
Yes. Even if it contradicts what we say here, if there is a provided word count, use that word count.
Professional standards are that you usually don't go beyond 10% off of the word count that is listed. Sometimes, though, you might feel like it's almost impossible not to, especially if it's a PDF product. In that case, you may want to, and this is always true if you're writing for someone else, anything, and something comes up, stay in touch with the person who assigned the assignment, get in contact with them, be like, hey, listen, so you said that you wanted to do like a research subsystem that every time you hit a new tier, a chase happens, and then you have to do 5 infiltrations, during which there's 100 different encounters, each of which have 3 custom monsters, and then it's a 32-page PDF. But I'm not going to be able to fit 300 monsters, 100 encounters, 70 infiltrations, 30 chases, and a research subsystem in a 32-page PDF, so maybe we should alter the number of pages.
And that works too for if you have ideas about changing the role of an NPC or something else you want to add that goes beyond the scope of the assignment. Check with the person who assigned it and see because sometimes they'll be cool with you running with that idea, and sometimes there are reasons why they want to.
Even if it doesn't exactly contradict what it says in the outline for your part. If it's a multi-part adventure or it's connected to the campaign world. You could be like, hey, so there's a quest giver NPC, and nothing else is said about them later on, but I want to have them do this helpful thing later in the adventure to show that they're not just giving a quest. But I'm aware that quest giver NPCs have a reputation for sometimes actually being the evil bad guy, and I want to make sure that that's fine.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of things like that that are just TLDR to ask the person who assigned you.
And if you're working on a multi-part, communicating with other folks who are working on the other parts is very useful too.
Correct.
So I thought we should start with that because that's sort of if you're writing it for someone who's assigned it to you, those are some tips. And then we can talk about more about what happens if you're writing it from scratch and what kinds of things would you want to include because in a lot of cases, if you're writing it for publication, for someone who's assigned it to you, they're going to give you an outline that has some more details about their format. So we can talk more about general advice, and then this applies, but it may not apply for every situation if you have a specific contract that says otherwise.
That's right.
So
what would you say is the most important general advice for someone who did not get assigned an outline by somebody else that is telling them everything that they have to do, but is instead they're just like, I'm going to do it. I have this great idea for an adventure. I'm going to publish that thing.
Yeah. So first of all, you've got your concept. Everything always starts with a concept for your adventure. You're going to want to make sure that you have a sense of a few other key parameters before you start filling in the blanks. You want to have a sense of level and length. Because the level in an adventure has so much impact on the kinds of challenges that you're throwing in and the theme and how that level interacts with the theme. That if you start even if you start putting in some basic blocks before you know the level, it's like, oh, I decided I wanted this higher level. Oops, none of these things that I put in actually work. And length so that you know how you want to pace it. And once you have a general sense of the length, then you can go ahead and put in some basic structure to the beats. You don't need to have the whole story figured out there, but if you're like, okay, I know I want them to start at level 1, and at the end I want them to reach level 6 where they fight this big bad villain, and along the way they should collect 4 pieces of heart or whatever. Just getting those basic beats in place first gives you a sense. Make sure that you have enough content to fill that sort of thing. You also want to have a sense of the adventure background fairly early on. The kinds of content that typically goes in an adventure background section for a published adventure, it can vary depending on the ones, but
in ancient times, the Empire of Thassalon had lots of mages who liked particular sins, and they built ancient ruins that were very evil. One of these ruins is bubbling up out of a swamp. Like, that's the kind of adventure background situation.
So adventure background type stuff is gonna tell is gonna tell the GM and also you things like, where is the adventure set? What are some of like the key locations in the adventure, and what are some of the key NPCs in the adventure and their motivations? So, what is changing recently that causes now to be a time for adventure? So it may be like, in this city, things were going great, and then the villain decided that they wanted to do a coup, and so this is so they've been starting to take these steps.
So that reminds me, when you're saying, like, why now or what's happening now, when you have a concept for a monster, the concept might be something like a snake that lives in lava, right? But when you have a concept for an adventure, you sometimes pitch it a little bit differently. And there's a lot of ways to do it, but if you're just starting out or you want to be able to create powerful concepts quickly, one of the best heuristics for it, it's not the only one, but it's one to use for yourself starting out, is when X, the PCs must Y.
Yes.
That is a great concept generator Mad Lib. So, and that Linda reminded me of when she was talking about, like, why now, what's happening now. So it's like, when the Thessalonian ruins bubble up out of the swamp, the PCs must deal with ancient evils exposed to the surface.
Yeah. And another thing to keep in mind for adventures is or else, sort of like, what happens if they fail? What are the stakes of
the villages near the swamp will be submerged under a tide of swampy undead.
Because if you know what happened, why now, and what are the stakes, those are really important things to know right up front. Once you have that, must Y, not must.
Oh, yeah.
Must letter Y.
Must
yes,
capital
not must,
letter Y.
Yes. Oh yeah, sorry about that.
Well, sometimes if your adventure hook is too cringeworthy, then the PCs must YWHY.
Yeah.
Like, an ancient ruin came out of the swamp again. Why? Oh my gosh.
What I'd recommend after that, and what is required in a fair number of like published adventures for other folks, is to go into a sort of expanded outline. And this is not to get the outline of your adventure that does sort of like encounter by encounter. And this isn't like, this isn't going to say everything that happens. Of course, it's just going to be like, hey, here, first here you've got like, we've got a moderate encounter with bears. And here we've got like, a trivial encounter with pixies or whatever. The reason that it's useful to go ahead and plot out encounter by encounter is this lets you figure out like roughly where the PC's leveling up. Do we have enough content in each section for where we want them to level up and what we want them to do? Is one of your ideas, were you thinking like, oh yeah, they're going to explore this fort and they're going to level up twice within the fort. But like, if you don't have enough ideas for stuff to do in that fort, then you may want to go back and change some of your other concepts around to manage it. And another useful thing about doing sort of that encounter by encounter outline without the full details is it lets you see what the balance of types of encounters you have in there are. Like, do you have a lot of harder combats? You might want to put some easier combats in there too. Where are the PCs gonna like be able to pause and breathe and rest and do downtime? And for like, where do you have social encounters? Where do you have skills? Where do you have those kinds of things? So this top level sort of plotting where you don't have necessarily everything in there, and you may not even know what kinds of creatures it is yet, right? Maybe you're just like, oh, we're gonna have in this area we're gonna have 4 moderate encounters and 1 severe and 2 lows or something like that. gives you a sense of what you're structuring.
Make sure to use a type of outline that matches your style of visualization. Some people do the whole, like, we learned it in grade school, we're gonna do like a Roman numeral and then a letter and then a number or whatever style tabbed outline that's written. But for some people, a flowchart of what goes where can be more useful, especially if you've got branching paths and options and possibilities.
Flowcharts are super useful for concepting adventures with branching paths, because then you can say, you know, this encounter goes to this encounter or this encounter, and you can look at each branch, like, is there a way, how does each of those branches bring the PCs back into the story? Because you're not in a published adventure going to be able to account for every possible thing that the PCs might do, but it's good to account for those likely possibilities, and so you can give the GM guidance of how to get them back and loop them back into the main story.
Yeah, for sure. I know that, like, even among Paizo adventure developers, you're famous for helping people to look at things through flowcharts to make sure that they're going to work. Because if you have an adventure and it's published, and we're not talking about the PCs just doing some random thing where you're like, should you do A or B? And the PCs are like, we will go to the moon to get cheese. It's like, okay, of course the adventure can't cover that. But if you have should we do A or B? And then if they do B, they're just drifting away from the adventure completely, that's a serious issue. And that's something that a flowchart will probably reveal to you right away, because B will suddenly, like, stop and the node won't connect down, or you'll be like, wait, what am I doing?
The most common A or B is fight A or ally with A. And ally with A may be like, ally is a more general term. It may not be literally allying with A. It may be like, you know, capturing the person alive and then questioning them and then finding information about.
But Linda, don't they have a Dear Diary in case you kill them?
Well, diaries are definitely a strategy you can do too. So this kind of gets into, like, the flow of information in the story. Like,
Dear Diary, today at Winter Wolf School, we learned about breathing ice onto people and eating them, and that is why I also learned to keep a diary by holding a pen in my snout and writing things down. I heard you can't be a proper villain without a diary.
So while you have, like, the sort of, like, where do the PCs go is a type of flowchart type thing or outline you have, there's also what do the PCs know? Because players generally are not going to remember something that's mentioned one-off or necessarily locate any particular piece of information. So even if you're, you know, you always get the advice for, like, mystery adventures of the rule of 3. Like, you know, if you want the PCs to be able to know something, make sure there's 3 ways for them to get to it. But that, you know, a similar thing applies for just adventures in general. You know, if you want the PCs if you want to be sure the PCs find or engage with a particular piece of information, make sure there's multiple ways for them to get that information that are reinforced. You can also look for, in that same point, like, you know, would you have choke points where it's like, if the PCs don't do this thing, then the entire adventure breaks? Look for ways to get around that and provide alternate answers as you're building up sort of this conceptual outline.
That's right. So when you're thinking about the outline, that can get you started. But obviously having a great outline isn't going to be enough to have a published adventure. I mean, many people make that kind of an outline even for their home game adventures, and they still wind up with an adventure that might not be ready for publication. So what would you say in terms of the execution of the adventure itself is important for a published adventure?
The hook, first of all. Because at the home group, you know, when you know you're designing something specifically for one group, you know you can count on, oh yeah, I know exactly what the abilities are of these people. I know exactly how they're going to want to get into it.
I know their backstory.
I know their backstories.
I also know that I brought the pizza and that I'm going to be like, come on, guys, I wrote this adventure. Yeah. Please do it.
Yeah. So there's a few ways to do the hook. First of all, if you're doing an adventure with pre-generated characters, then those characters are going to have then giving those characters some kind of a backstory and direct motivation, you can just you can just do that right away. I will point out, if you're doing an adventure with pre-generated characters, though, the pre-generated characters take a lot of time to do, and more so than you might think, to get them up to good publication standards. But assuming that
they always take longer than you think, and they take even longer than that if you're Paizo. Since you're not Paizo, they might not be as problematic for you. But if you're Paizo, then even just the smallest mistake is going to be an issue because of the numerous people who play through it and expect those pre-gens to be immaculate in a way that your other publications do not have. So keep in mind that you need substantial time for like editing or passing around a lot of people on pre-gens. If you are Paizo, you're probably not. So you may be a little bit more okay with pre-gens than otherwise, but keep that in mind if you want your brand to be that you're publishing things that are like up to the same standards.
Yeah. And with pre-gens, if your adventure has pre-gens, you're going to want to make sure that the adventure highlights the abilities of the pre-gens. Ways to do that, making sure that there are events that tie directly into things in those pre-generated character stories, making sure that the challenges that appear in the adventure are ones that the PCs are well suited to handle. There's nothing more annoying for players than like an adventure has like a hard thievery check somewhere, but none of the pre-gens have thievery, and so then they can't like handle that. So if you are doing a pre-generated character adventure, be sure that all of the challenges are ones that those characters are well suited to solving. And watch also for the abilities that you give the pre-gens. Like, there's no point in giving a pre-gen an ability that makes them be able to navigate effectively in forest terrain if there's no forest terrain in the adventure. So selecting abilities so that they're all going to be able to be active and come up at some point in the adventure is important too.
So if you don't understand this tip just immediately, instinctually from Linda describing it, what you can do is there's, I think, a free RPG Day adventure for Pathfinder 1st Edition that came out with the Advanced Player's Guide pre-gens that has monsters in it with a hardness that is high enough that like the pre-gens can't harm it, and a lot of it is like the opposite of that. So if you play that and watch the pre-gens like suffer, that will give you an idea of just like what a mismatch looks like, and then that way you'll be able to know if you wrote something with a mismatch. Because I know that like when it came to doing Paizo pre-gen adventures, when we were looking into them, we're like, okay, we don't want, we saw the feedback on that one. We want to make sure that your abilities feel like Chekhov's guns, that they come up, rather than having monsters that are like, oh my gosh, all our abilities don't work on these ones.
So there are a few things to look at there. There's the skill checks, like how good are they at the skills that they're expected to do, and then you were alluding to there's monster abilities as well. Do monsters have? If you're going to include a monster that has like a big weakness to something, it'd be cool if the PCs had a way of dealing that type of damage, or a monster that's highly resistant to something. If that's the main thing that a lot of the PCs do, then they could be in trouble. Or if the PCs universally have bad will saves, but then like the monsters do like lots of will save effects, then you're gonna see failure there. Or if the PCs tend toward the lower accuracy but the higher damage if they hit, and your monsters have like really high AC, then that could be frustrating too. So it's good to have a well-balanced party that brings a lot of different types of things to the table. But if there are situations in your adventure where skill checks are a bit more important, then to have multiple ways that the PCs could approach it that are supported by their skills. So it's not just relying on one player to be able to. It's like, oh yeah, well, this success is gated by a diplomacy check, but only one person is good at diplomacy. Maybe they could succeed by diplomacy, or they could succeed by like pickpocketing this person and taking the item, or something like that.
Also, if you are going to make a fight that is intentionally difficult for your pre-generated characters, do it knowing that you're doing that, and possibly that you have something else going on. Like, let's say you do have your pre-generated characters, and it's like a fire mage, and a fire elemental sorcerer, and a fire kineticist, and a fire elemental avatar, and everybody is fire.
Yes.
All the time. I'm a fire dragon barbarian, and then you make something that's immune to fire.
Yeah.
So make sure you understood, I have made this encounter that I know everybody's abilities are immune to, so make it like easier than normal in difficulty but count it as being a harder encounter. Or maybe there's some kind of like skill check you could do that causes like water barrels to fall down, or there's like other, and it's like, oh, maybe you have to sneak past because these things are immune to them or something like that. Make sure you go with your eyes open about that. So we have a question from Mr. Bass 21, who's come from 5e, and says that it seems community consensus is that Paizo's adventures are easier to run and higher quality than the published adventures for 5e. What specific aspects do you think adventure writers focus on leads to the higher level of satisfaction from the community? Well, I'll say, starting first, that there's a lot of things I've seen in people comparing the 5e adventures to the Paizo adventures, and some of them absolutely are in adventure writing style and ease of use, but some of them just come down to just the encounter building, because encounter building in Pathfinder 2nd Edition is pretty reliable. If it says it's severe, that fight's going to be severe. It's going to be a challenge. That can be scary. Whereas if it says deadly in D&D 5e, that might mean, like, way too easy, way, way, way too easy, just a little bit too easy, or even actually very hard if it has, like, particular monsters that match up badly to your PCs, and you don't have a like optimized group of PCs in a certain way. So that is one thing off the bat that helps, I think, overall the field published adventures. But there's several other things that I've seen people say, and I don't know if you've seen the same things, Linda, but. So I'll just go through this. So
yeah, I would rather you take this one, because otherwise I'm like, let me brag about how my team is better than
and so
or something like that.
One of the comments I've seen about 5e adventures is the organization of them. That sometimes they just sort of decide what order they want to present information on about the adventure in a way that made sense to whoever was writing it, but puts like the encounters you're actually going to encounter like way far apart from each other in the book. Like they'll have a section that that is labeled in a way based on like a world map or even a timeline that that puts like all of the timeline ones together, even ones that happen like very late in the book, and then other things are somewhere else, so it's just hard to find your next encounter. And that's something that organizationally Paizo adventures, actually a lot of adventures don't do that. That's just sort of a thing that 5e adventures do that I haven't even seen in as many third-party publications. Generally, adventures will go roughly in the order that they expect things to happen. And when we're talking about event encounters versus location encounters, for example, the Jewel of the Indigo Isles adventure path by Roll for Combat, of which Linda wrote one of the 3 parts, sometimes has event encounters that are mixed in with the location encounters. It will just do them in the order that the PCs are generally expected to go through, even if that means there's an event encounter here, and then a location encounter after that, and then an event encounter somewhere else, and then the events will have generally like a comment being like, this might not occur exactly here depending on the timing of your adventure. This is sort of where it's expected to show up. So organization is one of the things that I have seen. Another one is completeness, in that 5e adventures sometimes will just sort of like give you an idea, but they won't actually always like describe the areas that the PCs need to go to, or like put in the encounters and everything you need, so the GM has to actually do, in some cases, a significant amount of work. And that's not to say Paizo has never done something like this. For instance, in Council of Thieves Book 1, the first adventure path for Pathfinder 1st Edition, so quite a long time ago, but there was a situation where it's like, the PCs don't exactly have enough XP to level up. So you could do one of these 4 things where there's like goblin were-rats in the sewers or something.
But generally,
and the GM did have to make that up if they wanted to do that. However, that is by far the
Yeah.
exception, and I've never seen it again since then.
Generally, the Paizo Adventure publication standards assume that you're fully detailing out what the GM is going to need in terms of what do the areas look like, what are the creatures, what are they doing, how does this connect to the broader campaign setting, what are the what is the start, and what sort of at the very end of the adventure is the outcome. And having that kind of connective tissue that we've been talking about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think 5e adventures have a lot of cool stuff on them. A lot of them have cool themes, but the things I've seen people that the people didn't like the most were in organization, order, completeness of whether this is actually the entire adventure that you need or just sort of an outline for an adventure that you have to fill in. And then sometimes encounter balance issues that are really not anything to do with the adventure writer in 5e so much as like the 5e encounter system being a little less reliable for how difficult the monsters
But completeness is always a spectrum, right? I mean, if you look at, like, for example, Jewel of the Indigo Isles versus a Paizo adventure, Jewel of the Indigo Isles has a much higher...
Even more complete.
Has, like, a much higher, like, level of completeness where it really, like, goes in and tells you, okay, you know, here's what happens if the PCs do this. Here's how you connect back in a lot of cases. So you, depending upon your page count, and you know, you're gonna make that cutoff somewhere for, okay, you know, how likely does an alternative outcome have to be for me to put in information for how to handle it?
Sure, but I would say that Paizo at least throws it over like the middle of home plate by saying if the PCs just flat out do the thing that we, the author/developer of this adventure, expect is the standard default option, we will tell you exactly what you need.
Yeah.
Whereas 5e is on the other side of like, no matter what you do, there's a bunch of stuff that the GM, in some of the adventures, it's not on all of the 5e ones, there's a bunch of stuff the GM has to put in. Like that Council of Thieves one from Pathfinder, it's not 5e specific, where it's just like, no matter what you do, this part you have to write. Paizo will always give you everything that you need, assuming that you do exactly what is expected, and sometimes has some advice for when things move past that. Whereas, yes, Jewel of the Indigo Isles, where Steven was just like, I'll add however many more pages it takes, also is like, what if the PCs do this weird thing? What happens if the PCs lost the fight against this encounter? And other what-ifs to make sure that you're covered no matter what. But I feel like that is very helpful and makes it a deluxe adventure, but that, like, I don't think anyone is going to complain about a published adventure not having that Jewel of the Indigo Isles stuff, whereas, like, people do complain about the fact that 5e adventures sometimes do not have the minimum that is needed to run it without having to make up your own stuff where they give you an outline for it.
Yeah. So connectivity is connectivity in enough detail to follow the likely flow paths. And then when I say likely flow paths, one thing that's really valuable for adventures is to play test them. Have people, or you know, if you can't play test, at least have somebody else take a look at it who isn't you, because sometimes when you're writing an adventure, there are things that will seem really obvious to you. You're like, oh yeah, I knew that's what I was thinking, particularly when you're in a longer adventure, and that's just not clear at all. So, I mean, ideally you do both, right? You have somebody else read through it to see, like, were there details that were just up in your head that don't actually make sense? Or did you actually put everything onto the page that you intended to? And then for the playtest, the value there is, you know, did the encounters balance as you thought they would? Was anything, you know, actually harder? Or like, did the PCs pick some solution you just didn't even think of, and you're like, yeah, that's an excellent point. And then you want to go back and put a connectivity point in there.
Absolutely. So, Mr. Bass, that is just sort of, you asked about a question that sort of didn't say what you meant by talking about that disparity, so I had to come up with what I've heard other people say. So if you have another specific issue with 5e published adventures that you want to ask, like, are Paizo adventures like in the same boat or a little bit in a different boat for that, feel free to bring it up in the chat. But those are just based on some things I've heard of from the community on some of the 5e adventures. It looks like Kitsch at least also had the issue of that you need to do a lot of prep or just flat out adventure design to run some of the 5e adventures.
So I want to talk a bit about encounter variety, because variety is really important. When you're writing a published adventure, you don't know who is going to be playing that adventure, so you want to make sure that it will appeal to different play styles, different preferences. And
this is a corollary of what we talked about with the pre-gens, where you did know what the characters would be, because you don't know who the players or the characters will be. So in your home group, you know the players and the characters.
Yes.
With a pre-gen adventure, you know the characters, but not the players.
Yeah.
And when you don't know either of those, then you want to do the exact opposite of setting something up that is exactly perfect for the pre-gens, because if the characters don't come in with exactly those perfect abilities, you're in trouble.
So I actually should probably take a step back here to do sort of the alternate to pre-gens in terms of the hook, because the pre-gens have because I didn't quite finish what I was saying about hook. The pre-gens have a hook because you build it into their backstory and their story. Why do they want to do this? For other characters, you're going to want to provide some kind of a guiding principle of what's going on with them. Why they would, even if it is simple as
money.
PCs are, money, for example, or the PCs are concerned citizens of this town, or the PCs are
and a Thessalian ruin came out of the swamp,
yeah.
and undead murdered all of their friends, and then it's like, if the PCs still don't want to deal with the undead from the ruins, then the mayor offers them 1,000 gold pieces each. If the PCs still don't want to deal with the undead from the ruins, then the undead attack the PCs when they're trying to flee the region. And they still don't want to deal with it. What are your players even doing?
Yeah.
Like, you bought undead of the Thessalonian swamp ruin. They know you bought that. They can see the cover.
Yes. So Paizo Adventures handle this by, for your adventure pass, you have these full player's guides that give context to the players about, what's going on and provide new backgrounds and things like that. New backgrounds is a really cool tool that you can do in your adventures too. You could have a section in the beginning that's like, here's some basic info for here's the basic info that the players know. The kinds of information that's in those players' guides. It's like, what kinds of character types are going to be well-suited for this adventure? What are some backgrounds that are well-suited for this adventure? I would recommend doing, if you've got, a long adventure, somewhat of a shorter version of that. For things like, society adventures, Pathfinder Society, Starfinder Society, there's a shared baseline of, the PCs are part of this organization. So, an organization background is not the term background for this, but having a backstory where the PCs are all part of a particular organization is another way to bring them in. But you want to think about how much hook information you want to provide at the beginning of the adventure, because the more that you provide, the more you can build into. If you know the pieces are all part of a particular organization, then you can build into that. If you have, backgrounds that are based on particular parts of the story or ties to particular characters, then you can build off of that. You can say, the PC who has the raised by werewolves background, when they, later encounter this werewolf who raised when this werewolf appears later in the story, then this is an extra thing that happens. It gives you sort of a light version of what a home GM could do if they knew what was going on with the players, by saying, okay, I know that this is true about the players, so I can hook into that.
That's what we did in Jewel of the Indigo Isles, is add in extra special content for each of the backgrounds that exists in the player's guide, so that it's like, oh, well, if you have this background, this cool secret thing happens here, or you're offered to become the new leader of this place, or other things like that based on what background you picked. So, absolutely. Player's guides absolutely help you sort of bridge the gap between I'm writing for characters that I know and I'm writing for characters that literally could be anything, because if they pick the backgrounds from the player's guide, then you know a little bit about them now.
And then when you have sort of those presented backgrounds, GMs know, okay, I had a character who didn't pick one of the presented backgrounds. The player then is also making a choice that they are more interested in having that other background than having that, that direct connection to the story. So, if you say, oh, I don't want to take any of the provided backgrounds, I want to take another one, then you're also saying, you know, I'm kind of okay with if my character has a little bit less of a pre-built hook into the story. Because I had an option to take a pre-built hook into the story, and I said, nah, I'm going to take this one.
That's right.
So I was starting to get into, you know, diversity of encounter types, and then I realized that I hadn't quite finished the whole point. So diversity of encounter types, this is between combat encounters, like skilly encounters, social encounters, hazards, you know, complex hazards, simple hazards. You're going to have, you know, your subsystem type stuff, victory points versus, like, you know, when you have those skill challenges, is it like a larger thing, like a victory point subsystem, or even just like a simple victory point thing where you're doing a victory point counter, or is it just like, okay, roll once? Shaking up that level of focus. So, you know, your skill encounters kind of range from the, like, oh yeah, you know, it's just roll a quick skill check, to like a full-on subsystem. Combats might range from like basic trivial encounters that are there to show, like, oh yay, look, the PCs are awesome, to like your really tough, severe encounters. But having variety of type and also like scope and difficulty, and then placing those to pace things. So they're not. It's not necessarily exactly the same as simple encounters versus like complicated encounters, but that's another gauge to consider too. Like, you know, is this going to be an encounter that has like, oh, here's some bog standard animals, and we're going to fight the animals, and the animals fight until they're defeated, and then you win, versus like, is this an encounter that has like, there is a ticking time bomb here that's this hazard, and also these other things are going on. So, in terms of, like, how complicated the encounter is to run for the GM, how much, like, the players need to focus on, and how, like, challenging the encounter is to win, varying up those sorts of things, as well as sort of the type of encounter as you go through, is valuable, because otherwise you can get to situations where it's like, if you have a string of very easy and simple and quick things, then players might get bored or disengaged, but if you have a string of things that are really complicated, then players might get fatigued or frustrated.
That makes sense.
So you want to look at how that fits into your structure, so you can vary that up and sprinkle the harder ones in with the easier ones. Also look at how that fits with your outline for things like rest opportunities, both chances to, like, you know, take 10-minute rests or to rest for the night, as well as chances to take longer periods of downtime, because there's a very big difference between, like, you know, your dungeon with 20 encounters, but the PCs can you know, technically rest after every encounter because there's not time pressure, and, you know, your dungeon with 20 encounters, and, like, oh my gosh, there's only time to do 3 10-minute rests, and every time you do a 10-minute rest, like, this thing advances or whatever.
The doom clock advances.
Yes. So the reason why it's important to think about that stuff up front is because the structure of resting and time pressure is tightly linked in with the structure of how difficult and how many encounters you have. So you don't want to get yourself stuck in a situation where you've built this entire giant dungeon where it's like, oh yeah, and you've got this, and we've got this really close quarters where all these encounters are, and then you realize, crud, like, I didn't give them the rest opportunity, and, like, with a building this small, like, all 10 of these encounters should aggro in a row, and, like, that's death. So, like, now I have to try to explain it. But if you come up with what you want to do structurally first, then that can inform the encounters that you place, and that can also inform the maps that you design for your adventures. You know, how much space do you put between encounter areas, or to make sure that things don't all combine and completely get out of control.
I mean, I guess you could always say the adventures for characters 2 levels higher. They should be able to deal with all 10 of them aggroing in a row.
Yeah.
Not as long as it's not all at once.
Yeah. So you're going to want to combine both, like, things like alliances versus rivalries can also have encounters not combined. It's like, yeah, or like, my minions will handle this.
Minions!
But that's all part of sort of the pacing of that dungeon, and providing that guidance, because you are going to need maps for your published adventures. There's, you know, a fair number of GMs like to run theater of the mind type stuff, but that's not you're probably not going to want to write your published adventure entirely Theater of the Mind.
For Pathfinder, 2nd edition, or 5e, or any of those.
Theater of the Mind being like, you imagine the map, you don't have a physical map.
Because if you write it for yourself, you're going to have a good sense. Even if you're actually playing Theater of the Mind, or you expect some of your readers will, you still might want to have a map that doesn't have a grid on it at the very least, because you need to explain to them what the whole building looks like. Just even for Theater of the Mind, I would do that in a published adventure that was just like, this is only for Theater of the Mind, we have no battle map things. If you're not going to make it without any map, because if you just write in text, this room is connected to this room,
then it's going to be confusing.
It's going to get super confusing.
So you're going to want maps, and when you're doing maps, a few things to keep in mind, and you're creating these locations. Sort of the function of the location and how people interact with the location and the map itself are all intertwined. So there's a decent chance, like if you got a dungeon or a larger space or things like that, that there may be a situation where the PCs do something and that causes NPCs to react. So, like I was saying, is like, do they hear another encounter? Do they go do things? If this place gets attacked, do they reorient or do different things? And part of setting that up is being clear about what is the function of the map. Is this a guardhouse? Is this like, why are these people here? You can sometimes get into situations where it's like, they're caves and they're just like these monsters that sit individually in their rooms. But thinking about, writing into the adventure, how do these various groups that are near each other interact with each other helps give the GM a lot of information about things like, if they hear that there's lots of fights going on around, are they going to engage the PCs or are they going to leave? Who would they assist? Who wouldn't they assist? How much do they care about protecting this location? And what are how are they going to respond dynamically?
Right, that makes sense.
When you're doing maps, also, it's important to keep in mind both the function of the space from how do the people who are there use the space, and the function of the space from a combat sense, right? So, you could totally have a room that is like, yes, this room is a barracks, and so it's a very narrow room, and there's a bunch of bunks on both sides, and people are in the bunks and things like that. But if you then try to do a combat in that room, then it's really awkward. So thinking about where you place the combats on the map, and to place them in situations where you'll have the amount of space that you want. This is definitely a pitfall that you see where it's like, oh yeah, you have 4 large creatures, but the room that they're supposedly in is not even large enough to fit them. Because if you do a map design and aren't thinking about where, what is the size of the creatures, how do they use the space, and how are you going to fight in that space?
That's the stereotypical problem. It's just like, I can't even fit my monsters in this room, let alone the PCs.
Yeah. So you're likely to want to say, okay, there are some smaller rooms that are in this map that the PCs are going to be able to duck into and explore and things like that. But when I set my combats, I'm going to set them in these larger spaces. Or I'm going to set them where you've got people coming from a few different rooms into this large space. And you'll also want to consider what is there in terms of terrain that you're going to want to include in your encounter. Are there is there difficult terrain here? Are there other interesting features that the PCs might be able to interact with? We've talked about this more in some of our designing interesting encounters types of streams, but it does really all come together when you're building that adventure. So we've got a good, so you have an outline that has sort of your, okay, how do these different things connect? You think about how do your encounters go together. You think about how do the PCs get the information that they need. How do the PCs get any MacGuffins that the adventure, any critical items that the plot assumes that they have. How do the PCs get to these main touchstones that your story is going to assume that they have. And you also have a general sense of, okay, for some of these larger areas, how do those encounters interact and how do they fit together with the map? Transitions, very important. How do you get from so the PCs are here, in this dungeon, then they find the notebook left behind by the villain, or they capture someone and they ask them about it, or etc. And then they now know that the villain is planning to is planning to cause a new Thessalonian ruin full of undead to erupt from beneath the town in 2 weeks' time, and they also know that, in order to stop this, they need to go to location Y and figure things out there. So making sure that you have, specified, okay, how do the PCs figure out how to get to the next part of the adventure, and how much time pressure do you have? It's always important to know how much time pressure there is. An adventure that doesn't make it clear how much time pressure there is, you could have a situation where if there isn't time pressure at all, then the PCs are just like, yeah, we'll just downtime for forever. But on the flip side, you're generally going to want to include some opportunities for downtime and rest in your adventure. If it's just all running straight forward all the time, and then the PC's like, well, I don't have time to retrain, I don't have time to craft, I don't have time to do these kinds of things, then that can make it hard to stop and take a breath.
And these are all things that when you're making your adventure for your home group, you can figure out on the fly or gauge from your players and adjust it. But with the published adventure, you need to have this figured out ahead of time so that other groups are not going to run into trouble and have to do a ton of prep for the GM ahead of time, or have the GM stop the game for a while because the rest of the adventure doesn't work now based on what the PCs did or something like that.
One thing that you'll sometimes see in these sort of interim transition periods in games is things like random encounter charts. So I did want to talk a little bit about handling randomization in published adventures. When you have a random chart, generally, particularly with a game that's tighter balanced like Pathfinder 2nd Edition, you'll want to make sure that everything that is a possible random outcome isn't something that's going to be a problem. That you're not putting something on there. It's like, oh yeah, well, that's an extreme +1 encounter, but there's only a 1 in 100 chance that happens. Do you really want to have a D100 that where there's a 1 in 100 chance that oh my gosh, the PCs completely are gonna die from this encounter? So making sure that the options that you have on that are distinct. Also, if something is a random encounter type thing, you're gonna want to choose creatures for a random encounter chart that aren't ones that would likely have larger ramifications. So your random encounter table is not your place to put there's a random dragon here, or there's this random thing that would have a much larger impact on the broader ecosystem that the GM's gonna need to figure out.
I will give an exception to that.
Mm-hmm.
The exception to that is if you have some kind of big thing in the ecosystem that is just known to be there, and it's just you hear legends about it from the town, and it's not something you actually have to fight for the adventure, and the random encounter chart is, well, that local legend, we ran into it as a random encounter, and maybe we have to run away, or maybe we don't have to run away, but just it's there, and that just sort of exists to give the idea in the fiction that this thing that people are all talking about is here, even though it doesn't have to be related to the adventure.
Yeah, I would say that in many cases, though, if you're bothering to build it out that much, it's probably stronger to just have a planned encounter with something like that. But
at the very least, one way that you can do that is, let's say you're a site-based adventure, so you have the dungeon that's coming out of the swamp, but there's also a cave that you show in the distance on the map. There's this is the cave of the local Black Dragon. Black Dragon did not make this ruin come here, is probably not going to attack the PCs, but they could go to this cave if they want to fight the Black Dragon, and this is the treasures in the cave. And then in the random encounter table, it's on a 100, the Black Dragon was looking for some food and attack the PCs. And in that case, also, if they win that fight on the random encounter, they can go to the cave that everybody knows is the Black Dragon's cave and get the horde.
Because at that point, you have said, oh, there's a Black Dragon, so there's a good chance, or there's this local legend. Once you've dropped that, players are going to think it's probably part of the adventure. There's a good chance they're going to try to investigate. So having that content in there rather than leaving it to be just in a table is good. But it can be in the table too, in a way.
You have to add more to it though. You don't just put it there without saying anything, which I know is what you were getting at.
So having creatures with a low int score. You've got like, you know, constructs and animals and other things like that. Or, you know, creatures that have like a limited scope in their area and are not going to be connected to everything else would be good for those sorts of things. Because you know, there's nothing wrong with having random tables to help GMs pad things out a little bit. If it's like, okay, yeah, you know, we know that there's some variation here in the ways that the PCs might have done this. They may or may not have like done this entire section depending on how they did things. You know, we want to make sure that if you don't have enough like padding for the PCs to necessarily get to the level they're supposed to be, or if you're like, yeah, you know, this particular journey isn't like super important, but if you you can just say they get there, or you can put other things here. Another thing about journeys, because you know, some groups are just going to want to say like, yeah, we were at point A, then 2 weeks later we're at point B. But some groups are going to want to flesh that out more. The things that are along the way in journeys, they can be encounters that are planned. They can be random encounters. Also, things that are not combat, like just things that happen. Snippets of information that you hear from passersby, like, you know, running into a village that has like some weird thing going on, and like you solve their mystery and like a little mini adventure. Things like that can make journeys a lot more interesting. If it's like, okay, we're going from city A to city B, but along the way we stop in village C and this happens.
I think that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And generally the stakes of what's going on in those travel from place A to place B are going to be a lot lower, as I wave my hand in front of your face in a way that confuses your eyes. Yes. Yeah.
That's right. Like that.
Okay, yeah, you're right. That is really Anyway, so that's a bit about like, you know, transitions
and random encounters and things like that.
I would say another thing to keep in mind are handouts and sidebars. These are both very useful ways to pull something out of the main text. Sidebars generally like little references in the margins, of the page that the GM can look at and say like, they are ways to highlight information that you want the GM to be able to access when they're on multiple different pages of the document easily. So it could be, you know, like a sidebar about how a particular NPC behaves, who the PCs are going to be interacting with throughout a large area of the adventure, or a sidebar about, you know, like there are like either a sidebar handout that's for like, you know, hey GM, the PCs gain archaeology points as they explore this ruin and get things. You know, here's a checklist of the places where they can get archaeology points. So references like that are either like, here's how to handle these things, or like, here's a list of all of the places where blah happens, or like, you know, sidebars can also be a good place to put something that's not directly in the main flow of the text, but is like useful side contextual information. So it might be like, oh yeah, you know, this is a ruin that was formerly inhabited by Strix. And like, then there's a sidebar that's like, you know, hey, here's some more stuff about like Strix and their history in this area, or something like that. So yeah, having those sort of side elements, both for like, you know, additional reading material or like additional context, and also like for things that you're going to want to be able to reference back to from multiple points. And then handouts also can be like literally written out what people what people find on a written handout.
Diary,
yes.
Diary entry.
Generally,
dear diary.
Even if there's like
I hope that I'm not killed and that someone doesn't like read this diary off of my corpse. But if they do, I want them to not know about my secret treasure that is hidden in the following location with the following password.
Yes. Handouts, you know, you're not going to want to write the entire diary, right? You're usually going to want to keep it to 300 words or less. That's a general guideline that we try to look at too, for like, if you've got an NPC with like a box text, you know, there can be exceptions to this, but you're generally gonna want to keep. You're generally like, you're introducing the scenario or the adventure or whatever, and then like Like we think about like the like Pathfinder Society, Starfinder Society adventures. They start with that box text that says, "Hey, this is the venture captain, and they're telling you what do you need to do." The longer that the GM is talking, the more likely the players are going to tune out or not notice some of the details. So you're going to want to keep those particularly when you've got crucial information in there, keeping it short and sweet and snappy. So one of the ones that definitely comes up in organized play scenarios, became almost like a meme of organized play scenarios. So you want to avoid this thing that used to happen a lot in early Pathfinder First Edition adventures, where like the mission giver like doesn't give you crucial information unless you specifically ask for it. You don't want to do that. You want to have like the PCs need to have the information that they should reasonably get at the beginning of the adventure.
It'd be like if the PCs ask, "Are there any dragons around?" Then the venture captain says, "Oh yes, a black dragon. You should defend against acid." But because you'll definitely be attacked by one. But if the PCs don't ask, then the venture captain doesn't tell them.
Yeah, so
that was one of Linda's pet peeves, and now that she is the Overless, it shall never happen again.
Yes. So yeah, making sure that they have the context that they need at the beginning. If you are going to do kind of like a question or answer session with NPCs, whether it's at the beginning or elsewhere, have them say the things that you want them to say. And then they would logically want the PCs to know, and then like the questions can be more about things like broader context or history or like that kind of stuff.
Yep, I remember one of my PCs ran into one of those gotcha encounters that would only be told if you happened to ask the venture captain. Otherwise, it was just like. Otherwise, it's the PC's own fault for not asking the right questions, and the character got very angry at that venture captain. Then started asking when they're like, "Do you have any questions?" Is like, is there any other crucial information that you're withholding unless we ask a specific question?
Yes.
That was what she said to like
every venture captain
at the end after that. And then if the venture captain was like, "That's an inappropriate question to ask. Why would I do that?" It's like, well, venture captain so and so did. He didn't tell us about this giant monster that nearly killed us all. And then later he said, "Well, you should have asked."
Well, you can set up you should have asked type situations, but if you're gonna do that, they're generally the way to do that is like the NPC is like more like. You get to the end of the conversation, and then the NPC's like, "Wait, you never asked me where it was. What the heck? Why are you leaving?"
That's the kind of thing that you have them put in now. Is that like they do tell you, but then they're like, "Maybe you should have asked this, but just so you know."
Yeah, exactly. You can do something like that, but do make sure the PCs are equipped with information.
And you know what? If it's not the quest giver who's like the PC's boss, who's supposed to make sure that they are safe, like in the Pathfinder Society, it's okay actually if they miss information, if they don't ask a person. Because sometimes a random witness isn't gonna realize or remember that you don't know a thing, or that that thing was important to you as an adventure.
Yeah, but if the information is something that you really expect is important for the PCs to have, your NPC should probably be set up in a way that they're likely to give that information. Or you have a lot of different places that's like, in this part, the PCs are asking around about these kinds of things. And if the PCs ask these likely questions, then these kind of things happen.
That's right. It's like in the Gumshoe mystery system where you can't possibly miss any of the clues because you see what skills your PCs have, and then you assign them to the adventures you write in such a way that they will always be able to get all of the clues. Like, that's how that system works.
Roll the one. Yeah, you don't need to know where to go next.
Yeah, try to fail forward instead of failing into a pit. So to use Kitchafe's example of roll a 1, you don't need to know where to go next. Instead, if they roll a 1 on gathering the information of where to go next, they go to Ambush Alley.
Yeah.
And they do the Ambush Alley encounter where they get ambushed by ruffians who live in the alley that they otherwise wouldn't go to, but that they got a 1, so they went to there. And then after they defeat the ruffians, they find that actually the ruffians who ambushed them in Ambush Alley have another hint to go to the actual right place that they would have found if they succeeded. Like, that's a way to fail forward.
Or, some of the I'd say like one of the simplest ones that you can have is like, You find it eventually, but it takes longer, and because it took longer, XYZ.
Your doomsday clock.
Yes, because it took longer, you know, your opposition had more time to prepare and as reinforcements. Because it took longer, you don't have time to rest and you're fatigued. Because it took longer, you know.
You got lost and you had to pay for directions from local travelers, so the group loses X amount of money.
Yeah.
That fail forward by giving a consequence, but having them actually find it. If you fail into a quagmire of nothing, then that's gonna mess up your game.
Yeah, and published adventures ideally provide guidance from those, like, anytime that you're like, anytime that you have a check, you should also have in your mind what happens if the PCs fail.
That's part of your flow chart.
Yeah. You know, in a lot of cases, the check's just going to be like, oh, you know, the PCs failed this check. Okay, they didn't notice the trap. The PCs failed this check. Okay, they don't know this particular fact about this mural of ancient history, or that could help them later on. But if there's ever a case when it's like, the PCs failed this check, what happens? The adventure comes to a screeching halt. You're going to want to fix that.
Adjust it.
Yes.
So let's see. Do you have any other tips for published adventures? Probably too many.
Yeah, I could just keep talking.
But in these high-level tips, I think we went through a hook. We went through the structure. Let's end by going into the ending. So the conclusion. How do you conclude a published adventure? For a home adventure, you know, you're just with your friends. You figure out what you guys are doing, and then you might just lead into your next thing sort of organically because it's just something you're creating. What about a published adventure?
So we talked about in a recent episode about sort of the structure of adventures and how a lot of Western narratives and published adventures, you know, they've got their rising action, they've got their climax, and they don't spend that much time on the falling action.
Yeah, they just sort of have a conclusion that
jump
says
into
things.
And part of that is that, like, in a published adventure, you generally are going to be fairly tight on space. And you also may not necessarily know what the PCs are going to want to do in sort of that falling action phase. But it is good to still have a little bit of that in there. So you're going to want to have your big climax, your big giant encounter, your big giant victory situation for the PCs, as well as some of a sense of some guidance for the GM about, you know, what do you do in the aftermath. You know, if you have a very short published adventure like an organized play scenario, those usually just have like a quick paragraph that's like, you know, oh yeah, you know, you talk to the person who gave you the mission, and, you know, a few things happen based on what happened in the adventure, and that gets wrapped up, and then they say good job, and they send you on to your next one. But if you've got a longer adventure, you're probably gonna want to explore some of those possibilities, like, you know, what. So, you know, the PCs defeated the devils that took over the Monk Academy. You know, what happens with the Monk Academy next? How do the PCs help set that? Giving some information about things that the PCs could do, and how the world changes based on what the PCs do. Some guidance for the GM. Some of this is going to be handled by a lot of this kind of got to get handled by the GM based on what the players are most interested in exploring the aftermath of. But highlighting those is good. And giving a sense of what is the state of the world after the fact if the PCs succeed and if the PCs fail. Because the one time when you don't have to fail forward is the end of the adventure.
Yep. You could just fail into the world blowing up.
Yeah. You know, you could fail into that, or you could, but you can give fail forward stuff there. Usually failure at the end of the adventure is kind of one of the highest consequence failures, right? The villain succeeded and the PCs, you know, you might have had a TPK at that point, honestly, if the PCs fail or only a few of them survive. It's like you might have another group that comes in and does this kind of thing. But generally having like here's some of the expected results if the PCs succeed, here's some of the expected results if, you know, there may be more than succeed and fail in your adventure. It may be, you know, the PCs side with group A and succeed, the PCs side with group B and succeed, or the PCs go on their own and succeed anyway, or the PCs fail. And so
the Thessalonian ruin comes out of the swamp, and the undead kill the PCs and eat all the villages. 2 months later, new undead arrive out of the swamp. the PCs.
Yes.
Their undead forms are filled with vengeance and
Against these, yes.
against the other undead, and now they need to defeat the undead that are still there and avenge the villages that have all been eaten.
Yes. And for sort of that, I guess to go back a little bit to that climax, like that big final encounter, this is where you're going to pull out your higher difficulty. Like in a lot of cases, you're going to have a severe encounter and this sort of like big boss situation. This is where you're going to pull out more of the stops in terms of complexity in the encounter, because you want to make sure that those final fights are memorable and epic.
Mm-hmm. So I think that will tell us what to do with the conclusion. We talked about introductions, outlines, conclusions, and the middle. So we talked about all sorts of things for published adventures. If anyone else has any more questions, feel free to put them in chat. We've seen some questions from before.
I do have one other one. If you are, if you're making like new rules to go with the adventure, that's a cool thing that you can do. Generally for for Pathfinder 2nd Edition, having like new rare item or new rare type of thing that the PCs can get access to throughout the adventure is really cool. I'd recommend if you're putting something in the adventure, though, make it clear how the PCs can get access to it throughout the course of the adventure.
Make it something that's in the adventure.
Yeah.
Don't just do like, this was about a Thessalonian ruin that came out of the swamp and then there were undead, so therefore I'm going to make the Thessalonian undead creator archetype in the back of the adventure. Is there a way to get it? No. But, you know, it's about Thessalonian undead, so I'll just put that in there, and I'll put in 12 new types of undead that aren't in the adventure, as well as 5 undead magic items created by Thessalonians that you can't find in the adventure that are too high level for the adventure.
Yeah, don't do that.
That's an example of what not to do.
Because then you're giving the GM content that they're like going to try to figure out how to use, but they probably won't.
Or they just bought your adventure and they're like, well, I can't even use any of this.
Yeah, then you're giving pages that they can't use. So.
And even if I put this later in my campaign, like, it's just weird. They're like, oh yeah, 7 levels ago we fought a Thessalonian ruin in the swamp. That was like 3 adventures ago. Why is it here in like the Sky City in a different continent?
Reasons.
I bought the adventure and it was in there.
Yeah. It's just so much cooler whenever the stuff that's in the adventure incorporates into it, and there's a way, like, you know, if you've got like, oh yeah, you know, there's an archetype, then having an NPC who's like, oh yeah, this NPC can teach you how to take this archetype, or like, you know, this item is one of the treasures that you find in the course of the adventure.
Absolutely.
I guess I do want to say one more thing is that we sometimes see is authors trying to show off by showing how much complexity they can put in things. More complicated is not necessarily better. If you can get across a concept or an idea in a simpler fashion, then that's going to be better. So, like, you don't have to be like, oh, yeah, you know, I'm going to design a new, unique, bespoke subsystem that seems like something that was built on an Arcade Mark Workshop episode where people were just trying to make things as complicated as possible. A simpler expression of the idea is generally better.
That's right. Simple and elegant. So, I didn't see any more questions pop up in chat. And in that case, good luck with your published adventures, everybody. We'll say bye to YouTube and then do our outro. Bye, YouTube. See you next time.